All right. Hey, everyone. Welcome back for another deep dive with us. So today we're going to be looking at something that's actually unfolding as we speak, and that is this deportation of Nigerian nationals from the U.S. We want to help you get up to speed quickly on what's going on here. We've got a ton of recent reports from some Nigerian newspapers like Punch, Channels Television, Premium Times, and then we're also going to be pulling in some statements from Nigerian officials too. So are we ready to dive in?
Yeah, let's get into it.
Okay, so let's just jump right into it. Who exactly are we talking about here? Who's being deported? I mean, it's not everyone, right?
Right, yeah, there are two main groups that the U.S. is focusing on. The first is pretty straightforward, individuals who have been convicted of crimes in the U.S. But the second group is where things start to get a bit more, well, complicated, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
This group is made up of people who have violated U.S. immigration laws, even if they've tried to appeal those violations and were denied.
So even if they try to go through the proper legal channels, they could still be deported.
That's right, and this is where we have to consider the Trump administration's stance on immigration.
Right.
It's really all driven by his America First agenda. And it has particularly affected Nigerians.
Okay.
We've seen Trump's policies, like ending birthright citizenship, so that means children born in the U.S. to non-citizen parents would no longer automatically be U.S. citizens, and then also deploying more troops to the U.S.-Mexico border. I mean, these actions have really created an environment where enforcement is just really heightened.
Yeah, I see what you mean. I mean, knowing the rules is one thing, but then seeing them be put into practice like this really paints a different picture.
Exactly.
So where are all of these people being sent? Are they being sent back to their hometowns?
Well, that's a good question, and the answer is actually kind of surprising. No matter where they're from in Nigeria, all of these deportees are being sent directly to Lagos.
Wow. So even if someone is from, some small village hundreds of miles away from Lagos, they're still just going to land in Lagos.
Yeah, that's right.
I can only imagine that that adds, yet another layer of difficulty for those being deported. Do we know how many people are actually being sent back?
Yeah, so the first group that's actually scheduled to arrive in Lagos on February 18th, 2025 is 85 people. And these are people who are already convicted of crimes and are currently in U.S. prisons. But this is just the tip of the iceberg, really. There are, as we speak, 201 Nigerians that are currently in U.S. immigration detention centers.
Okay.
And a far greater number could end up facing deportation sometime in the future.
Do we have any idea how many we might be talking about here?
Well, U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, we all know them as ICE, has said that 3,690 Nigerians have been identified for potential deportation. It's a huge number,
Wow.
and it's the second highest number in Africa, right behind Somalia.
So clearly this is, a large-scale operation, and it could have some pretty serious consequences. And speaking of those consequences, we know that some Nigerian officials have voiced some concerns about these deportations, right?
Yeah, they have. Bianca Odumegwu Ojukwu, who is Nigeria's Minister of State for Foreign Affairs, has actually been pretty vocal about this. She's really pushing for a humane approach to this whole process and is urging the U.S. to make sure that this deportation adheres to international guidelines.
Okay, that makes sense. I'm curious, what are some of her main concerns? Because it sounds like this is more than just a logistical issue.
Oh, absolutely. She is deeply concerned about the human impact of these deportations. The emotional and financial burden that is being placed on the deportees, as well as their families in the U.S. and in Nigeria. I mean, for many of these people, they've built lives, they have careers, they have families in the U.S. Some of them have been there for decades. And so to suddenly be uprooted and sent to a country that they might not have lived in for years is just incredibly disruptive.
Yeah, of course, that makes sense. I mean, that's a huge adjustment, not just for the person themselves, but for, their entire network, their family, everyone connected to them. And I can imagine that there are some serious financial concerns as well, right?
Oh, absolutely. Odubegwujuku brought up this very valid point. She basically asked, will these deportees have enough time to settle their affairs in the U.S.? Will they even have a chance to manage any assets that they have, or will they just be, as she put it, bundled onto planes?
Yeah, I mean, that's a powerful image. It really makes you think about the lack of control and the feeling of being uprooted practically overnight. So, do we know anything about what happens to, the assets and the belongings that people are leaving behind?
That's actually one of the big unknowns at this point. There really hasn't been much information released about what the U.S. plans to do with those assets. And it's something that's causing a lot of anxiety. I mean, this lack of clarity just opens the door for potential legal battles, logistical challenges down the line.
It sounds like there's just so much that we don't know right now. And, all of these unanswered questions are obviously creating a lot of fear, a lot of uncertainty. So we've talked about who's being deported. We've talked about the role of the Trump administration in all of this. And we've talked about the initial concerns. But there's still so much more to unpack here.
Absolutely there is. I mean, there are so many layers to this. We've been discussing the immediate impact, on the people being deported, but what happens next? What are the wider consequences? What about when those planes actually land in Lagos?
That's what I'm thinking about too. I mean, what kinds of challenges are these people going to be facing when they get there?
Well, I mean, for a lot of these people, they're going back to a country they barely even know. Some of them left Nigeria when they were kids or haven't been back in years and years, maybe decades.
Right.
They might not have family there, there's no support system in place, and they're coming back to a country that's completely different from the one they left.
Wow. I mean, it must be like starting your life over, but in a place that's both familiar and totally foreign at the same time. Are there resources there to help them kind of reintegrate back into society?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And the answer is it's complicated. There are very limited resources in Nigeria to help people returning like this. There's just no guarantee that they'll get any support with things like housing, finding a job, or really any other basic needs.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, it raises some serious concerns about their ability to rebuild their lives.
That's a tough situation to be in, for sure. And I imagine the economic impact probably goes beyond just the people being deported, right? I mean, it has to affect their families too.
Absolutely. I mean, think about it. A lot of these people were sending money back home to their families in Nigeria. Those remittances are a lifeline for a lot of households.
Right, right.
And so when that income suddenly stops, it can be devastating. It can push families into poverty and have ripple effects throughout entire communities.
Yeah, so we could be looking at serious economic hardship, not just for those who are deported, but also for their families back in Nigeria.
Exactly, yeah. It's like a chain reaction.
Wow. So then there's the whole question of how all of this is going to affect the relationship between the U.S. and Nigeria.
Right.
I mean, could this lead to tension between the two countries?
Yeah, there's a very real possibility of that. I mean, like we've already talked about, Nigeria has some serious concerns about the lack of transparency in this whole thing,
Mm-hmm.
and the potential for human rights violations. If those concerns aren't taken seriously and addressed, it could definitely cause some diplomatic friction and strain the relationship between the two countries.
So it seems like Nigeria is in a tough spot. They want to protect their citizens and make sure they're treated fairly, but they also want to keep a good relationship with the U.S.
Right.
What do you think? What are some potential long-term consequences that this could have on their relationship?
Well, this whole situation has the potential to really damage the trust between the U.S. and Nigeria, and that could affect their cooperation on things like, security, trade, even development assistance.
Right.
I mean, the U.S. relies on Nigeria as a strategic partner in West Africa,
Yeah.
and any kind of strain on that relationship could have, huge implications for stability in the entire region.
That makes a lot of sense. A strong partnership there benefits both countries. It seems like this situation could throw a real wrench in the works. So we've been talking about the political and economic consequences, but what about the social impact on Nigeria? How might this influx of returnees affect society as a whole?
That's a great question, and it's a really important one. Think about it. These communities are going to have to absorb this, sudden increase in population, and that's going to put a strain on resources, things like housing, healthcare, and education. And then there's also the issue of social reintegration.
What do you mean by that?
Well, there's a chance that some of these people coming back might face, some stigma or even discrimination.
Okay.
People might think that they somehow failed in the U.S. or that they're different from the people who stayed in Nigeria. And this can obviously lead to social isolation, make it even harder to build new lives.
Wow, it seems like there are just so many challenges ahead, both for the people being deported and for Nigerian society as a whole.
It really is a complex situation. And it's so important to remember that we're talking about real people here. With families, dreams, hopes, aspirations. They're stuck in the middle of this huge web of international relations, immigration policy, and human rights.
Yeah.
And their stories are a really powerful reminder that political decisions have very real human consequences.
It's a good reality check for all of us. And, as these deportations continue, I keep thinking about, what kind of psychological impact this is going to have on the people being sent back to build a life somewhere and then to be uprooted and sent somewhere else, somewhere that might feel like a foreign country. It's just hard to imagine the emotional toll that would take.
Oh, absolutely. And, that psychological impact is so crucial, but it's often overlooked. A lot of these people are being hit with a double whammy. They're dealing with the trauma of being forced to leave the U.S. And on top of that, they have the stress of starting over in a brand new environment.
Right.
And that combination, I mean, it can lead to feelings of isolation, anxiety, even depression.
It just seems like there are so many complex and difficult questions that these deportations bring up.
There are, you're right. And it's important to understand that the consequences, they go way beyond just the actual deportation itself. There are going to be long-term effects on individuals, families, communities, and even the relationship between the U.S. and Nigeria.
It's heavy stuff, and I think it's so important for us to take a step back and really acknowledge the human side of all of this. These aren't just numbers we're talking about. We're talking about real people, real lives being completely turned upside down.
You're absolutely right. Their stories deserve to be heard and understood. This is a situation that demands our attention, our empathy, and our commitment to finding real solutions, solutions that are both just and compassionate.
I couldn't agree more. We've covered a lot of ground here, but there's still so much to consider. What happens next? That's what I keep wondering too. What happens next? We know the first group is supposed to arrive in Lagos very soon, but what about all of the others? The hundreds, maybe thousands that could be deported later on.
I think the thing to keep in mind here is that all of this is happening against this backdrop of global migration, and the world's political landscape is constantly changing. What we're seeing with the Nigerians in the U.S., it's just a small piece of a much bigger, much more complicated issue. I mean, this is something that we're seeing all over the world when it comes to immigration.
So this isn't just a story about the U.S. and Nigeria. It's about understanding these global trends and how they're affecting people and entire countries.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so interesting. How do we, as global citizens, deal with these kinds of issues in a way that is humane and effective? I mean, it's a tough question. There's no easy answer. But this situation definitely forces us to confront some hard truths about how we treat people who are seen as outsiders.
It's easy to get lost in the political back and forth and forget that there are real people at the heart of all of this. Their lives are being completely upended, and a lot of times they're treated like pawns in this big political game.
Right? It's a reminder that every policy has a human cost. And we need to be more aware of how our decisions affect other people.
Yeah.
I mean, think about it. If suddenly 3,690 people were forced to leave your city, your town, it would have a huge impact. Now imagine that happening on a national scale.
Wow. Yeah, that really puts things into perspective. It's not about numbers on a page. It's about families, communities, and the entire fabric of society being disrupted.
Exactly. And this brings up some big questions about the role of governments, not just in the U.S., but in Nigeria, too. What responsibility do they have to protect their citizens both at home and abroad? How can we make sure policies are carried out fairly and humanely?
Yeah, those are huge questions, and I don't think there's an easy answer to any of them.
You're right, there isn't, but I think it has to start with awareness. We have to acknowledge that this is a complicated issue and be willing to have tough conversations about it. We need to go beyond the simple narratives and really wrestle with these nuances of immigration, identity, and what it means to belong in our globalized world.
That's a really powerful message. So what can the average person do? What can we do to actually make a difference here? Because it can feel so overwhelming.
Well, one of the most important things is to stay informed. We have to educate ourselves about these issues and be able to identify the misinformation that's out there, especially when it comes to immigration. We can also support the organizations that are out there fighting for the rights of migrants and helping those who are being deported. Even little things like donating to a charity or volunteering some of our time can make a real difference.
It's about finding a way to connect with the human element of this story, to see past the statistics and understand what it means for real people, real families.
That's it, exactly. And that's what I'm hoping you'll take away from this deep dive. This deportation of Nigerians from the U.S., it's a complex issue. It has so many different layers, and there are some really serious consequences. It's about policy, it's about politics, but ultimately it's about people, it's about families, it's about searching for a better life. And it's a story that deserves our attention, our empathy, and our commitment to finding solutions that are based in justice and compassion.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thank you for walking us through this and for helping us understand such a complex and important issue. I know I learned a lot. I hope our listeners did too. So until next time, keep those questions coming, stay curious, and remember, even in the face of these huge global challenges, each and every one of us can make a difference.